Hello, welcome to Spotlight, a warm haze of creative luminosity.
Spotlight, brought to you by the Isle of Man Arts Council.
This evening, we hear from Brighton-based Manx poet Simon Maddrell as he launches his latest poetry pamphlet, Isle of Sin. Hear about the search for the new Manx Youth Bard. And a bunch of amateurs prepared to take to the stage. Remember, do get in touch with any creative artistic endeavours you may be involved in, planning, hoping to create or would really like to put in the spotlight, be they poetic, visual, theatrical, musical, literary, ceramics, textiles, mime. Just email me, spotlight@manxradio.com, or if you prefer, howardkane@manxradio.com. Well, it's all about the poetry this evening. We'll hear from the self-proclaimed queer Manx poet Simon Maddrell in a few minutes about his latest publication, but first, it's only a matter of days now before the new Manx Youth Bard is announced. That's the successor to the wonderful Eva Petrova, of course, whose poetry we've enjoyed on a regular basis here on Spotlight for the last few years, and thank you very much to her. I'm sure we'll hear from Eva in years to come. Now, applications to be put forward for consideration for the new Manx Youth Bard have now closed ahead of the final event to announce the new bardic position, which is happening this very weekend. To find out more about how it all takes place, I rounded up event organiser Bridge Carter, former Manx Youth Bard Annie Kissack and current Bard Michael Manning, and Bridge began by explaining how they decided to separate the events for the two bardic positions on the island.
We do the Manx Bard in August, and the children is usually around March, February, March, end of February, beginning of March time.
And the idea is to sort of encourage people, I suppose, to get into poetry then at a younger age. 'Cause I know some children take to it like a duck to water, and for others it's a bit of a mystic art and something that you maybe come to appreciate in later life.
Yeah, it's a good platform to build up their confidence when they're young. I think like public speaking and things like that, and it's a platform to sort of express themselves. So I think it's a good start, a good time to start.
And we do have two bards here. When did you come to poetry, Annie? You seem to have been writing for as long as I can remember.
Oh, it just feels like that. quite recently, really. Probably about 5 or 6 years ago.
Really? As recent as that?
Yeah. So I don't think I wrote any as a child, apart from one in Mrs. Clark's class when I was 13, for which I got 9+ out of 10, which never happened. And that was a one-off.
So was it a progression from the music for you? Because you've certainly done music for a long time. And you've done the choir as well and the singing.
I think the same energy and the need to create and do things yourself, it seems to come from the same place, at least for me. It's an outlet for something. I don't entirely know what it is, but it's necessary. And I do think it, and I'm not talking about me here particularly, but it does apply. I think it's very helpful for your health, really, your mental health, to be able to think about things, to express them, to let them go, perhaps keep them to yourself, or perhaps share them with others. And I think lots of people have, and lots of young people as well, have mentioned that, certainly. So I think the Youth Bard is a great idea.
What about you, Michael? Are you a lifelong writer, or did you come to writing in poetry later in life?
Yeah, do you know, I can't really remember when I started writing poetry, but then I can't really remember much about what happened past kind of last week, really. So it was back there somewhere. I mean, I think I've had a lifelong love of language, and I remember from an early age would be immersed in books and language and everything. And I think I probably turned to writing poetry, as Annie said, as a mode of expression, probably during adolescence. And none of that poetry would be worth sharing with anyone necessarily, but certainly for me, it's the language and the emotion and how that comes together in sort of imagery and expression that's always been really powerful. And I think, you know, everybody just loves language. I mean, I've got 2 young boys, you go into the libraries and there's so many of the children's books are all about rhymes and the rhythm of language. It's just a beautiful thing, and I think the more you can sow that in and enjoy that from as young an age as possible, possible, I just think that enriches you and people you share it with.
Totally. And again, as Annie was saying, maybe you were sort of rather scathing of your early attempts at poetry. However, as Annie says, it's a great outlet, isn't it? Even if you don't share it with anyone, even if it never sees the light of day again, if you can put down your sort of, get rid of your angst, get rid of any pent up sort of anger or whatever the case may be, put it down into creative use like a poem. It's a way of dissipating it, isn't it?
It is, and it's a way of clarifying, I think, what you're feeling and what you're thinking about things. So it's not just a sort of a splurging expression, because it involves, thinking and shaping words on a page and how that sounds and the play of language. And so I think that helps you sort of think through things. Certainly even for me today, when I'm writing a poem and when I'm composing it, it helps me clarify what I am thinking and what I am feeling, even if I've started with a particular emotion or a particular image. So I think it is a lovely, healthy thing to do.
So here we are then, coming up to March time. So we're coming to the time when we are looking for the next youth Manx Bard or Manx Youth Bard. I'm not quite too sure which way to put it. Manx Youth Bard. Manx Youth Bard. I'll get it right way around. The next Manx Youth Bard to succeed the wonderful Eva Petrova, who's been in the role for the last 12 months. So what happens, and when's it going to happen? What happens first? How does the process of choosing the next Youth Bard actually take place?
So we get all the applications in by the end of the month. Then they all go to the judges. A select committee of judges then will narrow them down. Then they will narrow them down to the best, usually the best three, best three, isn't it? I think we usually come to.
So far.
So we cut it down as much as we can. And then the bards themselves judge those three, and that gets judged on the same day as they get inaugurated.
Yes, which this year is the 3rd of March.
Mm-hmm. The final decision to actually choose the Youth Bard, is that in a performance setting?
There's two parts to it. We would normally ask so far we've asked people who've got through to that stage in a fairly informal setting to just read one of their poems to the panel. That's away from the public at that point, and have a little chat to them about, do they write a lot? What was their motivation? And we get an idea of how confident and what sort of people we're dealing with there. And then they sort of disappear for a short period, and then the judges will confer, and then we will announce who is the bard. It's all, the judging and the inauguration happen on the same event, so the public or family or whatever will be waiting outside really, and then we announce who's won, and they will read something, presumably the thing they've just read, to us. We'll say a little bit about why, and there's a little bit of a ceremony, and we have readings from various bards, sometimes youth bards, we can get them back from university or whatever. We will have usually one or two, maybe more, of the adult bards to do a poem, nothing too long, and then a lot of photographs and little ceremony, and of course they get to wear the rather exciting robes.
The bardic robes.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yes. And the staff, yes.
The staff looks even better. I like the under
Yes,
staff.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah. What do you actually look for then when you're looking for a bard? Is it, as you say, confidence? Is it creativity? Is it magic with words? A mixture of all these things?
I think it's all of the above, Howard. Obviously, if you are representing an organisation, you will be asked to come and read and perform in various settings. So having a degree of performance skill is certainly something we would expect. It would be difficult if you didn't want to read aloud, I think. But that's only part of the thing. We will look at it, I think, quite freshly if we feel that somebody is saying something important or saying in particular. The magic of words will always be a factor, I'm sure. There's no set script from our point of view. In the same way, nobody would agree on what exactly makes a good poem. So we'll come together and share ideas. And generally, we find over the years that there's high degree of agreement amongst the judges, even though we might all come from different backgrounds and expectations as to what is particularly successful. So yeah, lots of things go to inform who and how and what we decide.
And the performance aspect, I suppose, had you done much performance before, Michael? Because it is, as Annie was saying, the role I suppose you are expected to perform, and yet with poetry, for some people it's a case of they might not be performers. They might like writing and they might like reading poetry, not necessarily performing.
Absolutely. And I mean, I was one of the astonishments about getting selected as the Bard last summer was the fact that I've never performed or shared my poetry publicly prior to that at all. I mean, I've quite enjoyed public speaking in various different settings through most of my life, but I still get very nervous about public performance. I mean, I love public performance, and there is nothing as wonderful as sharing something you've written in a room full of people and seeing the power that those words have in affecting people and inspiring people and making people think. And so the public performance aspect of things is always a bit nerve-wracking for me, but it is also something that I really love.
And did you enjoy the performance aspect? Were you a bard, Annie?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought you might somehow.
It's funny, but I am a very nervous person, and sometimes that can actually help. I think it gives you, a sort of intensity to what you do, and I think it doesn't help. There isn't a type of person who you could expect to perform well or not. I think all kinds of people, often the very quiet introverts, are the people who do particularly well in these sorts of settings.
Have you been surprised at the standard of poetry with the bards since the inception of the Youth Bard?
Yes, we've had four youth bards now. They've all been very different, different ages too. We've had quite young people when they, relatively speaking, nearer 13 or 14. Different sorts of poetry, very different styles, different subject matters. Some people with interest in, I suppose, folklore or history, and then you've got people looking quite deeply into aspects of contemporary life. All the poets that we've had, from Holly McRae, who was our first youth bard, wasn't she? And then we've had Xander Shirtliff, and then we had Brintha, who was, I think, produced poems that were of great depth and sophistication, and really got involved. And then we've had Eva, who sort of follows through in that tradition. Written work looked good from all of them, and performance styles were good as well, but in very different ways. So I think we've been very fortunate, a very high standard indeed.
And they work well with the bards as well. Each bard takes on sort of like a mentor
almost
sort of role.
Informally.
Yeah.
They've encouraged, the one has encouraged the next on the line, which is a bit like it is with the adults too. I think we can tell people what it's really like. We've been lucky, I think.
And we'll hopefully hear more from the Youth Manx Bard event next week, and we will most certainly be asking the new Manx Youth Bard themselves, whoever he or she may be, to come and perform here on Spotlight through 2023.
Spotlight, brought to you by the Isle of Man Arts Council.
Questions of gender identity and sexual education have been somewhat to the fore in Manx news of late, and as is always the case in an era where individuals can drive news agendas courtesy of social media, and with the words sex, gender and young people all cropping up in the same sentence, it's been rather prominent in the news feeds of larger off-island organisations as well. So it's perhaps fitting that Manx poet Simon Maddrell has a new pamphlet of work coming out at the end of the month. Brighton-based Simon describes himself as a queer Manx poet thriving with HIV, and his latest collection of Isle of Sin embodies stirring and, as he puts it, unapologetic poems that circle the queer history of the Isle of Man, with a particular celebration and lament for the life of Manx actor Dursley McClendon, whose life was an inspiration for the Channel 4 drama It's a Sin, which was such a success. I caught up with Simon from his home in the environs of a sunny Brighton and began by asking him about the inspiration behind this latest collection.
It's a subject I've been thinking about for quite a long time, for obvious reasons, I guess. I mean, it was a couple of poems in my debut pamphlet, Throatbone, and with there being the 30th anniversary of the partial legalisation of sex between men, that, of course, prompted me to write some more about it. I've actually been supported by Culture Vannin to write another Manx pamphlet. And what happened during that process was I created so many, if you like, more traditional Manx poems, but also these poems as well. And with It's a Sin coming about and the greater awareness of Dursley McLinden, I ended up with a whole bunch of poems around queer Manx history and around a celebration of his life that I then basically found a publisher to pull those together. And I think it's important to document history and for, you know, those lesser told stories to be retained and kept, because they have value.
You mentioned Dursley McLinden there. Now, a lot of people will obviously know the name. Just tell us a little bit more about Dursley for those who aren't so familiar with him.
Yeah, well, Dursley was an actor, a singer, even a magic circle magician. He was actually born 6 months before me in Douglas in 1965, and unfortunately, he was one of the earlier people who succumbed to HIV and AIDS and died in London in 1994, just aged 29. But he was a remarkable actor and, from all accounts, a remarkable man as well, and fought tirelessly to carry on working until just before he died, but also spent a lot of time supporting raising money for other people who were struggling with HIV/AIDS illness. And all in all, a remarkable man that deserves to be remembered, as far as I can see.
The pamphlet as well, I mean, you're talking about celebrating the life of Dursley McLinden, also talking about exploring the darker years prior to the partial legalisation in 1992. How important is it to you to actually bring this to sort of wider awareness through the medium of poetry? Is it something that you feel still needs to be appreciated more, perhaps, for those not in the know?
Well, I think with everything we learn from history, we don't learn from history that's washed away or even denied. You know, and the pamphlet also gives credit to the Manx government for their apology for the laws in the first place. And, you know, probably unknown anywhere else in the world, this year, of course, we had an apology from the police in the way in which they implemented the laws. And, you know, my poems talk to a lot of the evidence and the testimonies of people who experienced what was going on at that time, not just in terms of the harassment of Alan Shea for putting his head above the parapet to call for the legalisation of sex between men, but also far more insipid things that were going on in terms of the targeting of gay men. And I mean, I was brought up in Greater Manchester under the notorious James Anderson, and his sidekick was Robin Oak, who of course was imported from across into the Isle of Man in 1986, and that heralded the start of the replication of the same tactics and harassment, some would say persecution, of gay men in the Isle of Man. And I think it's important to realise, you know, there's a lot going on. I'm sure you're aware in social media at the moment around relationship and sex education, and people throwing around the words abhorrent and we need to protect our children and all of these things, you know, and you know, that's a sign that those behaviours, that bigotry, can return as quickly as it disappeared.
I was going to say exactly that. I mean, do you think, have we improved? Have we just sort of swept things, as you say, just under a veneer of acceptability, whereas there's still hatred in certain quarters bubbling, or prejudice bubbling underneath the surface? Or do you think we really have moved forward as a humanity, as a sort of a race in whole? Do you think we've actually made real progress, or, like you said, are just sort of sidestepping things?
I think the answer to your question is, the two questions, is yes and yes. We've absolutely made tremendous progress. We've made less progress in the treatment of people who are trans. We're seeing the same sort of tropes being cast around that gay men and lesbians had in the 70s and the 80s. But there's an enormous progress. I mean, the Isle of Man should be proud, going beyond the UK in banning conversion therapy for people who are trans. So the laws have caught up and in some cases extended beyond the UK. But of course there are still pockets of bigotry. There are still people who believe that, despite the law of the land, that they have the right to exclude their children from being educated to value diversity. And the truth of the matter is that 20% of lesbian and gay and bi young people attempt to commit suicide. 40% of trans people, young people, attempt to commit suicide. Now that is abhorrent. That is unacceptable. And the fact that queer kids experience bullying every single day in school, and that includes people in the Isle of Man, because I've spent a lot of time listening to young people from the lesbian LGBTQ youth groups of what happens. And therefore we need to remember that this is about lives. The people who took their own lives in the late 80s and the early 90s, that's still happening today at a lower level. And unless we do something to address it, we're talking about people's lives, not protecting children from having a chat with a drag queen. We're talking about straight parents' children bullying other kids. We're talking about straight parents' children taking their own lives. That's why it's important.
Always lovely to speak to Simon. I think he was on the island. I saw him last anyway, hosting the Poetry Slam this year, if memory serves correct. And as I say, our chat was rather timely, it seems. We'll hear more from Simon next week, and also some of the poetry, of course, from the new collection. And now, as they say, for something completely different. We heard from the Legion players Steph Gray a while back about their first new production in a while, A Bunch of Amateurs. You might have remembered the film. The show is taking place at the Peel Centenary Centre. It opens tomorrow, Thursday the 2nd. Director Sonia Callan gave us an idea of the plot.
Well, it's about an American superstar, Hollywood superstar, who actually is not getting the roles anymore. But he thinks that he should, and then he lands this role, fantasy in a way. They're thinking in a little village in the British Isles. They're thinking, oh, can we get a big superstar to star in our Shakespeare play? And he arrives, but it doesn't all go the way he expected.
Being done under the auspices, as you say, of the Legion Plays?
It is indeed, yes. We were 90 years old last year. We didn't quite manage to have the big celebration we were planning for lots of things, sometimes related to hospital and COVID and holidays and goodness knows what else. Yep. So we pushed it forward to March. So we're on March the 2nd to the 4th down at Peel Centenary. Legion Plays has been going since 1932, originally started by the soldiers that came back from the Great War, who wanted to raise money for their colleagues. So they put on Journey's End at the Gaiety, and history records that there were 3 sell-out performances, from which the Legion players formed, originally with no women allowed.
Oh,
but then
shocking,
eventually,
shocking.
but eventually women were allowed to join. And there's been so many great actresses and actors on island, part of either the Legion players or the service players. Some amazing productions, 3 and 4 productions a year. So yes, that's the Legion players. We're still going, we're still raising funds and supporting the Royal British Legion.
Check it out if you can. Great fun, great venue, and raising money for a good cause as ever, as Steph explains. Tickets, I believe, still available. You can get them online via the Peel Centenary Centre. In person, I think, at Celtic Gold in Peel. That's about it this week. Don't forget, if you want to hear anything again, go to maxradio.com, download the Spotlight podcast, listen where and when you want. Why not try it whilst skinny dipping in the Irish Sea in early March? Just check you've got waterproof earbuds. See you next week. Look after yourselves, and whatever you're doing, be creative about it.